Good day. Hi, welcome to Biology 103. The first chapter that we'll be covering is chapter 1, and it's talking about the study of life or the science of life. So, one of the first things that we want to do is kind of look at the characteristics that define life. And there are 6 of them that we will eventually get to. One of the things that I want to make clear is that we know that life exists just about every single place on the earth, whether we're talking about the air, whether we're talking about in the water, okay, or whether we're talking about in the crust of the earth. Life exists almost everywhere, on our skin, in our bodies, okay? Our body itself, we are an organism. Each one of our cells can live, okay? So life exists just about everywhere on the earth. So we know that the earth possesses a great variety of diverse life forms, whether we're talking about a fungi, or whether we're talking about a giraffe, or whether we're talking about a bacteria. Every living thing, we know, again, they have or share certain characteristics in common. Can you name any of the characteristics that help us to define what we consider to be something that we say is alive? Can you describe any of those characteristics, or name any of those characteristics? Okay, so let's move on. All right, so here are some of those characteristics. We want to say life is organized. So life exhibits a complex organization, and what we're going to eventually do is trace that organization to the most basic unit of matter, which is the atom, to the most complex, which is the organism existing in the biosphere. We know that life requires an outside source of energy and materials. So in other words, what we're saying is the organism, in order for it to stay alive, it has to take in some type of nutrients. And we know that life has the capacity to reproduce and develop. So whether it's an asexual reproductive or whether it's sexual, life responds to its environment. When you get hot, what do? You start fanning, okay? So we are described as being irritable beings. Life maintains an internal environment. We're going to talk more about that, but every one of us knows that you would probably have to see a physician if your sugar was out of balance in your body. So if the sugar is too low, then the doctor will say that you're hypoglycemic. If your sugar is too high, then the doctor is going to tell you that you're hyperglycemic and that you have some form of diabetes, okay? So life maintains an internal environment, and life has an ability to adapt to the environment that it is exposed to. Let me pause this for just a sec. But the most basic unit, which is the atom, which is what you see at the very bottom of this screen, and then we move to the molecule. If we take some atoms and put those together, we get a molecule. Several molecules make up a cell, then tissue, then organ system, then finally the organism. And then when we start grouping these organisms of the same type, we have species. And then again, we're going to go to population, community, ecosystem, and biosphere. But we'll talk about each one of those individually. All right, so let's begin with the atom. So that's what's at the bottom of the screen. It says that the atom or element is the most basic unit of matter. Okay, I didn't say life. I say it's the most basic unit of matter, okay? And we know that the atom is composed of protons, neutrons, and electrons. But then it says if we take different types of atoms, or even sometimes the same type of atom, it says that we can join them together and we can form a molecule, okay? And then when we take molecules of various forms, then we form a cell. We know that the cell then is the most basic unit of life, okay? So that is the most basic or the fundamental unit of life. We want to call that the cell. We know that bacteria are living organisms, but they are unicellular. They're only made of one cell. We, on the other hand, as well as plants and other organisms that we'll talk about later, but we are multicellular, okay? So we have several different cells making up our tissues. And then it says when you group cells that have a common structure and common function, then you form tissue. So on the left here, you see nervous tissue, and then on the right, if you're facing the screen, you see leaf tissue, okay? And then it says when we get several different tissues together that are functioning together to perform a particular task or function, then we have an organ. So here is the brain on the left hand side of the screen, and then on the right hand side of the screen we see an actual leaf, okay? And you can see the various types of tissues that make up the leaf, okay? Then it says when we get together several organs, it says we can have an organ system. For example, the nervous system. The nervous system would have all those peripheral nerves, and then the central nerves coming off of that peripheral nerve. That's going to make up a nervous system, okay? And then on the opposite side, you see the shoot system. You see the leaves and part of the branch, okay? And then it says, if we take this a look, okay, if we have several different organ systems put together, okay, so in other words, like if you looked at the human, for example, we know that they have an integumentary system, that is the skin. You have a nervous system, you have a circulatory system, you have a urinary system, okay? So when you take all these different systems together, then you form an organism, okay? And then it says when you have several types of the same organisms that are able to interbreed, okay, so species, okay, specific, it says then you have a species. When these species gather in a particular area, then you constitute a population, okay? And then once you have the population, it says when you have more than one type of population interacting in the same area, then you constitute a community. And then when you have that community plus including the environment, then that constitutes an ecosystem. And one of the things that this doesn't mention is it says that if we have ecosystems that cover large areas, then we can refer to those as biomes. So in other words, an example of a biome would be the ocean or the tundra or a desert. Those are examples of a biome. And then it says, finally, it says the regions of the earth's crust, the waters, the atmosphere are inhabited by living organisms. So the biosphere basically is any area, whether it's in the earth's crust or whether it's in the water or even whether it's in the air or the atmosphere. It says this constitutes a biosphere. Any area that can sustain life constitutes a biosphere. So let's move on. So our first characteristic that define life was that organisms exhibit complex organization. So our second characteristic of life is that organisms require energy and materials. Organisms require an outside source. Okay, so organisms again need an outside source of energy and materials in order for them to stay alive. They have to eat. Think about it. If you don't eat, for a long time, you're very weak. Okay, so you get up in the morning or in the afternoon, depending on what kind of fasting thing that you're doing. But you eventually you have to break that cycle and eat something. Okay, you're fasting cycle and have to eat something. Otherwise, life cannot be sustained without you taking in some type of nutrient source. So it says all organisms need an outside source of energy and materials. We know that plants, they have the ability to take in water, and they also absorb the sunlight, and they create glucose in the plant cell, which is something that we need. Okay, we need that glucose in order for us to sustain life. All right, so energy, what is it? What is the definition? It says it is the capacity to do work. Okay, so energy is the capacity to do work. So we want to also know our third characteristic of life is that organisms are able to reproduce and develop. They're able to reproduce and develop. And we said we did whether it was either asexual, which is what bacteria do, for example, or whether it is sexual. Okay, and we also do, especially when we're making the body cells in our body, that is an asexual type of reproduction. When we produce an infant, okay, then we know that that is a sexual form of reproduction in order to replace life. So it says life arises from life. So reproduction is a process by which an organism makes more of itself. Again, we said that bacteria, they go through a process that's called binary fission, where they just multiply the DNA, so they make another copy of their DNA, and then they make more cytoplasm, they elongate, and basically they pinch in two and have an identical copy of themselves. So in many multicellular organisms, fertilization is followed by cell division and development, and that's how you produce an adult organism. So remember, you start out with this one cell where the egg and the sperm's nucleus have fused together, and then after a series of divisions of that cell, you end up with basically a morula, okay, and this blastocyst that basically implants in the uterine wall. But it takes development in order to produce the adult organism. So that one cell became or was transformed into many different types of cell tissues. Okay, because we're not just one cell. We have now brain tissue, we have skin tissue, we have muscle tissue. Okay, so as you can see, development has to take place. So it says, well, how do we develop? What's controlling all that? Well, it says genes are the units of info within an individual's DNA and are passed to offspring during reproduction. We know that the word DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid and is present in all organisms, and it is responsible, again, for directing whatever the cellular functions. It's going to tell, depending on which part of that gene is being expressed, it's going to tell whether that cell is going to become a muscle cell, or that cell is become nerve tissue, or that cell is become bone tissue. So variation arises when genes are recombined, especially when we're talking about sexual reproduction. When the sperm, let's just say this, when a female is creating her egg or whatever, the dad's DNA that was donated to her and her mom's DNA, they're recombined. Okay, and we'll talk about that a lot later. But anyway, but again, variation arises when genes are recombined, expressed differently, or even mutated. Okay, so genes can be mutated. I think I'm out of time for this particular video, so I will pick up with the second video a little later. But thanks for tuning in.